A little while ago, we had to take our daughter into the hospital because she was having nonstop seizures. Once we got there, we were given a choice. Either submit to a nasopharyngeal COVID-19 test, or she couldn't be admitted. In the end, after a few hours of negotiating, they agreed to do a cheek swab and she was admitted. But what happens if the next time we have to take her to the hospital, they demand that we submit to a vaccine or to some other procedure that might harm her? A lot of people argue that as a private entity, the hospital has a right to deny us service if we don't comply with whatever it demands it makes. And I actually agree. But then we have the right to create alternatives. We have the right to create hospitals with policies that we're comfortable with. We currently live in a system of medical authoritarianism. This isn't actually new. Government agencies dictate who may practice medicine and who may not. It dictates what medicine may be practiced and what may not. It even controls what can be said about medicine and about medical treatments, and it prohibits medical treatments that don't have its approval. It controls access to medication, and it prohibits the establishment of hospitals and other facilities without its approval. Government responses to COVID-19 have made this much worse, with pregnant women forced to wear masks during labor, family members prohibited from visiting loved ones in hospitals and in nursing homes, and elderly people forced to live and die in isolation. And governments and businesses pushing to require vaccination with a new rushed-through vaccine that won't even prevent transmission as a condition for access to things like travel, employment, education, and entry to events. So what do? We start with a declaration. We have the right to care for each other. We have the right to choose our medical treatments. We have the right to decline medical treatments. We have the right to create our own hospitals and care facilities that respect our rights and our choices. This declaration will make a lot of people angry, because a lot of people don't want other people to have freedom of choice when it comes to medical care. In order to regain our freedom of choice, we need to understand how these people have come to have so much power over our choices. Because if we don't properly understand how we got here, we can't come up with successful solutions. First, don't mistake the problem for the solution. So what does that mean? A lot of people think that the reason we have such a costly, authoritarian healthcare system dominated by pharmaceutical companies is that there's not enough government oversight of this industry. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Healthcare is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the US and in most countries. But it wasn't always this way. I'm going to focus a little bit on the US because that's where I am, but a lot of this applies in other countries as well. In the early 19th century, existing licensing laws in the US were relaxed, and there was a period of free trade in medicine. During this period, alternative therapies such as homeopathy and botanical medicine, also traditional Native American medicine, flourished. Americans were among the healthiest in the world. The US had the lowest infant mortality in the world. Medical care was very affordable. This made a lot of people angry. It made the doctors' associations angry because they didn't think doctors were being paid enough. It made the sellers of patent medicines angry because they had to compete with homeopaths and botanical practitioners who were actually earning better money than they were. So some of these people demanded that the government step in and rectify the situation. And it did. Licensing laws were brought back and made even stricter, curtailing the supply and raising the costs of doctors. Medical education was reformed in a way that dramatically restricted the number of schools and the number of doctors who came out of them. The practice of the lodge doctor came under assault by the AMA and other medical associations. So the lodge doctor was a common thing in the 19th century. These were doctors who were hired by fraternal societies to provide medical care for their members. The average cost for a member was $1 to $2 per year at the turn of the century. That was about a day's wages for a year's worth of basic medical care. The AMA and other medical societies imposed sanctions on doctors who signed lodge contracts. The National Fraternal Congress also lobbied for laws mandating minimum rates the fraternal societies could charge. Between the attacks by the AMA and other medical societies and the NFC, this low-cost way to provide healthcare was eradicated by the 1930s. At the same time, medical schools were also under assault following the Flexner Report. In 1906, there were 160 medical schools in the U.S. The AMA commissioned educator Abraham Flexner of the Carnegie Foundation to evaluate these schools. Flexner determined that the vast majority of the 160 medical schools should be closed, and the rest modeled after his alma mater, Johns Hopkins. Between 1910 and 1920, 46 medical schools were closed, and by 1930, only 76 medical schools remained. Schools for women and for African Americans were especially hard hit, as were schools teaching what are now considered alternative therapies. In 1910, when the Flexner Report was released, there were 907 women medical students. By 1915, that number was nearly halved to only 592. Before the Flexner Report, there were 7 medical schools that served predominantly African American students. After the report's release, there were only 2. This had a huge impact on African American communities. For example, after 1910, Mississippi had 1 doctor for every 14,634 people that served Black communities, compared to 1 doctor for every 2,500 people nationwide. The report also had a devastating impact on non-pharmaceutical medicine. At the turn of the century, an estimated 15% of doctors practiced homeopathy. There were 22 homeopathic medical schools and over 100 homeopathic hospitals in the U.S. By the 1930s, the practice of homeopathy had been almost completely wiped out throughout the country, all because of a report commissioned by a medical association with a strong interest in restricting supply and eliminating competition from non-pharmaceutical medical practitioners, and the power to enforce its interests through its influence over government-mandated medical licensing and medical education. Over the years, regulation of medicine and of healthcare has only increased, reducing supply, raising prices, and restricting alternatives. So much so that we now speak of a crisis in healthcare, and there are again calls for the government to step in and fix things. But very little recognition that what got us here in the first place was precisely that, the government fixing things. But don't we need the government to protect us? Don't we need licensing to protect us from fraudulent doctors, incompetence, and quacks? Don't we need the FDA to protect us from dangerous drugs? In fact, medical licensing may not do what many think it does. There's no evidence that licensing physicians and other medical practitioners improves outcomes or safety. Protections that patients do have come from things like private credentialing organizations and the tort system and malpractice liability. From economist Shirley Svorny, state boards have a poor record of disciplining errant physicians. A study of Florida physicians with malpractice payouts over $1 million found that only 16% had been sanctioned by their state medical board. Among physicians who made 10 or more malpractice payments between 1990 and 2005, only 1/3 had been disciplined by their state boards. Meanwhile, licensing boards do censure physicians who practice in ways that run counter to medical establishment orthodoxy. In particular, those who challenge the orthodoxy around vaccines. In California, for example, the medical board charged doctors for writing medical exemptions for vaccines that were required for school. This was a practice that was perfectly legal. And in Oregon, Dr. Paul Thomas, author of the book The Vaccine-Friendly Plan, had his license suspended in December of 2020 when the Oregon Medical Board declared him to be a serious danger to the public health. Strangely, the board only discovered this serious danger 5 days after Dr. Thomas published a study comparing the health outcomes of vaccinated patients versus unvaccinated ones. In that study, the outcomes of the unvaccinated patients were much better than those of the vaccinated. In light of such experiences, patients and physicians alike might understandably come to the conclusion that medical licensing is more a tool for political control than for consumer protection. In fact, the evidence shows that licensing does not accomplish much in the way of protecting consumers. Again, from economist Shirley Svorny, A closer look suggests that most patient protections are unrelated to state licensing. Licensing boards rely on private organizations for much of their credentialing activity, disciplinary efforts are largely ineffective, and consumers receive little information from licensing boards that helps them choose quality clinicians. Hospitals and other healthcare providers may be liable for negligence in the credentialing, selection, retention, and supervision of health professionals. So the tort system liability already provides protection from negligence and other misbehavior on the part of healthcare professionals. Private malpractice insurers also provide consumer protection by providing guidance and incentives to improve the quality of care. Physicians with high claims may face premium surcharges called experience rating. The demand for clinician credentialing has grown to the point that a sophisticated industry now collects and verifies information about individual clinicians for hospitals and other clients. This is all outside of licensing. Nearly 85% of U.S. physicians are independently certified by specialty boards. If state licensing were eliminated tomorrow, says Zvorny, consumers would continue to be protected by this sophisticated network of well-known private organizations that accredit healthcare facilities and credential medical professionals. Because licensing reduces access to care and may give consumers a false sense of security, it may in fact do more harm than good. Okay, but don't we need the FDA? Delays caused by the FDA in bringing potentially life-saving medications to market are responsible for far more deaths than the number of lives saved by that agency's oversight. According to economist Dale Geiringer, the benefits of FDA regulation relative to that in foreign countries could reasonably be put at some 5,000 casualties per decade. The cost of FDA delay can be estimated at anywhere from 21,000 to 121,000 lives per decade. More stringent restrictions do not necessarily mean safer outcomes. The FDA was much less powerful before 1962, yet the US was not plagued with unsafe drugs. Regulatory agencies in other countries have much quicker approval times for drugs and medical devices, yet the probability that a marketed drug will be removed for safety reasons in those countries was not appreciably greater in the UK than in the US. This is from the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. Other industries monitor safety through certification by private voluntary organizations. The Independent Institute's Daniel Klein writes, "How is safety assured in other industries? In electronics, manufacturers submit products to Underwriters Laboratories, a private organization that grants its safety mark to products that pass its inspection. The process is voluntary. Manufacturers may sell without the UL mark, but retailers and distributors usually prefer products with it." Suppose someone proposed a new government agency that forbade manufacturers from making any electronic product until approved by the agency. We would think the proposal to be totalitarian and crazy, but that is the system we have in drugs. Even without the FDA or government oversight, producers are still liable for their products and services and can still be held accountable through the tort system. Just as they were prior to the establishment of the FDA, and just as they were prior to 1962 when the FDA's powers were greatly expanded. And I'll just add as an aside, there are manufacturers of medical products and devices now, vaccine makers in particular, who have gotten exemption from this kind of liability, and that's obviously a huge problem. But don't we need certificate of need laws so we don't end up with too many hospitals? Don't we need the government to make providers of healthcare accountable to the people they serve? In fact, government regulation ends up creating less accountability to consumers, as we've seen with, for example, granting exemptions to liability. Because they are monopolies, agencies such as the FDA are subject to being captured by the industries they are supposed to regulate. This is nowhere more clear than with the power the pharmaceutical industry exerts over the FDA and the CDC. A system of competing private credentialing agencies is much less susceptible to capture because any agencies that become captured by producers will have a hard time competing with those that are more honest. But how can we possibly take care of the most vulnerable members of society without the government? So let me tell you a little story. This is my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1900 and passed away in 2003, just short of her 103rd birthday. She was a school teacher in rural Nebraska and Iowa, and she was a member of a mutual aid society called the PEO Sisterhood. The PEO Sisterhood was founded by 7 young women who were students at Iowa Wesleyan University. Some of the 7 had been invited to join the school's sorority, but not all of them. So the 7 friends formed their own organization dedicated to promoting higher education for women, and they also established homes across the country for members to live in their old age. The deal was any member of the PEO who wanted to live in a PEO home would give a large portion of their assets, however that much that was, whether they were rich or poor, and as long as they were able to mostly take care of themselves the day they walked in, they would be cared for in the home for the rest of their life. So they could have a debilitating stroke the next day and they would still be cared for the rest of their lives. When my grandmother was almost 95, she moved into a PEO home in Nebraska. She spent the last 8 years of her life there, receiving an incredible level of care. I visited her frequently. I spent the night there. I got to know the people. This was really an amazing level of service that's hard to appreciate if you haven't seen it firsthand. And there's no sense in which this was a care facility. This was a home. Members ate their meals together, they prayed together, they watched Nebraska football games together, and there were, activities going on all the time. They were living together as a community. So what did this cost my grandmother? She sold her house, this was in around 1995, sold her house for around $15,000. Even back then, that was not a whole lot of money. I believe she donated the bulk of that, maybe all of it, I'm not sure, to the PEO. This bought her 8 years of amazing quality care. In any commercial facility, it might have covered a few months. The woman who ran my grandmother's PEO home told me that one of the main reasons they were able to provide such an exceptional level of care at such a low cost was that as a membership organization, they were exempt from many of the expensive licensing requirements other facilities had to comply with. This came to an end soon after my grandmother passed away, when the state of Nebraska decided that membership organizations would no longer be exempt from these requirements. The state also cracked down on the PEO's method for funding the homes, saying, according to the new manager of my grandmother's home, that they were unfair. And so, rather than being promised a lifetime of care by their voluntary society, PEO members in Nebraska were forced to rely on Medicare and to pay monthly for their accommodation in the home. The woman who had run the home when my grandmother lived there left because she said they were no longer able to provide the level of care that they once had. This story was repeated across the country, and there are now only a few PEO homes left, including the one in Beatrice, Nebraska, where my grandmother lived. In case it's not clear by now, the state is not the solution to our problems. The state is the problem. So what is the solution? When the British government occupied India, it declared a monopoly on the production of salt. Salt and the salt tax was a significant source of revenue for the British Empire. Salt revenue officials could break into facilities where salt was being produced illegally and seize it. On March 12, 1930, Mahatma Gandhi began his march to Dandi to defy the British government's prohibition on ordinary people making and possessing salt. By the time he reached Dandi, he had been joined by tens of thousands of others who opposed the British monopoly on salt and the salt tax. As he grasped a handful of salt, Gandhi said, "With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." This nonviolent protest became known as the Salt Satyagraha. It inspired civil disobedience by millions across the country, and it was indeed the beginning of the end for British occupation of India. It is time for medical satyagraha. It is time to assert our rights as sovereign beings to live as we choose so long as we do not harm others. What might that look like? It will look like many different things in many different places. Here's my idea. Sanctuary jurisdictions for medical freedom. Local jurisdictions declaring themselves sanctuary cities and counties for medical freedom. Nullifying state and federal laws and orders that violate individual rights and sovereignty. Allowing the establishment of independent hospitals and care facilities. But how is that possible? Through the nullification of laws that violate our rights. Nullification can come in many different forms. States or cities voting to nullify or not enforce federal or state laws. States refusing to accept federal money that comes at the expense of local decision-making power. State-sponsored lawsuits against unconstitutional federal actions. Local authorities simply refusing to enforce federal or state laws that violate the Constitution or fundamental human rights. Nullification has a long history. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was federal law that made it a crime for anyone to help an escaped slave, even in the North. Many abolitionists simply ignored the act, nullifying it as individuals, and many Northern juries refused to convict those who violated the act. Eventually, Northern states passed legislation nullifying this federal law. Said abolitionist John Greenleaf Whittier, "Since the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law by Congress, I find myself in a position with respect to it which I fear my fellow citizens generally are not prepared to justify. So far as that law is concerned, I am a nullifier." William Lloyd Garrison agreed. The nullification advocated by Mr. Whittier is loyalty to goodness. More recently, since 2016, more than a dozen states have considered legislation to ban material support or resources for NSA mass surveillance programs in their states. And beginning in 1996, states like California and Colorado started passing legislation that nullified federal prohibition of medical marijuana. Sheriffs are especially important. Why? Because sheriffs have the legal power to determine which laws are enforced in their jurisdictions. And because each of them has sworn an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution and the rights it is intended to protect. This is a crucial time in American history, and we actually have a peaceful and effective solution to it. The only thing that needs to happen is your local officials, especially your sheriff, keep their oath of office, says Sheriff Richard Mack of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. We saw this happening in 2020. Many sheriffs across the country refused to enforce their state's lockdown and mask orders. What does this mean? It means that in the same way that sheriffs and other local authorities across the country have refused to enforce unconstitutional lockdown and mask orders, sheriffs can refuse to enforce laws that violate constitutional or common law principles and our individual rights. It means that we have the tools right now to establish medical freedom sanctuary cities and counties all across the country in a way that is perfectly legal and peaceful. It means that right now we have the ability to create jurisdictions where people can choose their own medical treatments based on their own judgment, build hospitals and other care facilities that respect individuals' rights and choices, where doctors can practice medicine as they believe is in the best interests of their patients and in accordance with their Hippocratic oath, instead of being controlled by licensing boards that are beholden to the pharmaceutical industry. Right now, counties and cities can nullify certificate of need laws, nullify the authority of medical licensing boards, nullify prohibitions on drugs such as hydroxychloroquine or anything else, nullify any and all regulations that suppress the provision of medical care. But why would they want to? Well, here's why medical freedom is good for local jurisdictions, or why it can be. More medical services on the market means cutting local government healthcare spending, especially with emergency services. More private EMT and urgent care facilities in particular will cut costs for the state, for the city, for the county. The promise of a free market jurisdiction for healthcare will make any city or county a magnet for investment. It will also attract both practitioners and consumers who value freedom of choice in medicine. And none of this requires implementing any radical reforms, creating a new system, or even necessarily changing legislation. So is this something that can only be done in the US? No. The specifics of how to create medical freedom jurisdictions may change from country to country, but the principles are the same. This can be done anywhere. Is this only about medical freedom? Of course not. What can we do right now? First, educate yourself. Go to the 10th Amendment Center to learn about nullification. These are just ideas. These are just a few little suggestions that I have. Educate yourself about common law, the tradition of common law. The power of sheriffs. Go to cspoa.org, Sheriff Mack's organization. And if you're in the US, consider taking Sheriff Mack's 6-week online course on restoring liberty through the power of the county sheriff. There's a link there. Reach out to sheriffs. Reach out to your local sheriffs or sheriffs in other counties and talk to them about medical freedom, about what's at stake, and about how being a sanctuary jurisdiction for medical freedom can benefit the counties they serve. Talk to them about the oaths they swore to uphold the rights protected by the Constitution. Connect with others and build community. Here are some organizations to get you started with that. People's Rights, www.peoplesrights.org. Freedom Cells is another one. The In Power Movement. Freedom Airway, where they're trying to create an international association of people interested in free travel. These are places to start. There's lots more out there. What else can we do right now? Start making plans for hospitals and other projects that respect medical freedom. Create your own mutual aid societies or projects to support your own communities, whatever community you're in. We have the right to take care of each other. We have the right to care for ourselves and our families as we choose. We have the right to use alternative medicine and therapies, and to decline vaccines or any other treatments we don't want. We don't demand that those in the medical establishment stop doing as they choose, only that they stop interfering with our right to do the same.